On to the next video. Again, apologies for the quality, but I'm filling this right after the last one, so let's get into it. So, let's talk about taxation, specifically how you should handle it. I have a plan to end taxation. I have already made a video on it. But of course, until that plan is realized, taxation or some form of forced duty, essentially theft, is required to fund the state. Whether people like it or not, that's just how it is. You can't exactly get something from nothing, so you need funds to buy the things that you need. That's just how it is. And then there's the matter of the tax code itself. Specifically, who should you tax? Some people just say tax the rich, but let's face it, you can't just target one person and hope that they pay for everything. And let's go through that, honestly. The rich can't afford to pay higher taxes. They have more money, that's just how it is. But the poor can contribute more on sheer numbers. Think about it. If you take $1 from every person on Earth, you'd make more money than if you took 5 from the top 1%. It's just by the numbers, that's how it would work out. Even if you took it from the lower 50%, you'd still have pretty good odds, honestly. And so, let's say a 1% tax increase on the poor will likely pay out more than a 2% tax increase on the rich. Now, of course, where you get the taxes from specifically does have an impact. For example, an income tax on the rich is far less effective than a dividends tax because, generally speaking, the rich are more locked into assets, stocks, properties. That's where they make their money. It's why, for example, even though the rich have a higher income tax, generally they pay less in terms of what they make because, well, most of their money isn't coming from their income. Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg, fun fact, actually tend not to make as much as you'd think given their roles as CEOs of people in the higher ends of business. Where most of their money comes from is the dividends from their stock in their companies and the many other avenues that they make their money besides their actual salaries. It's why you can have someone grow by billions yet only pay so much in income tax because income tracks the salary. It's not tracking other forms of income that haven't been realized yet, like stock. And of course, capital gains taxes have their own risks, which we'll get to in a bit. But the poor, quickest way to make money off of them, if we're being honest, sales and income taxes. They're just more efficient because, plain and simply, as one might know, those are considered more regressive taxes because, yes, the rich make more in income. That's true. But the poor take it worse because 1% of their income is far less than 1% of, say, someone who makes 7 figures. And of course, if you're talking about sales tax, that is a very regressive tax because, well, no matter how much someone has in money, they still pay the same in a sales tax. It's just how it is. Now, of course, the rich can buy more, but still, if you're talking about like $100 of groceries, regardless of whether that person's poor or rich, they're going to pay the same in sales tax. Now, truthfully, the regressive or progressive nature of the taxation doesn't matter as much as the income, because that's the entire point, to make enough income to pay for the state and its functions. If you can do that, you're good. Sure, it's better to do more progressive tax rates, largely because the poor really can't contribute that much, and if you burn them out as an economic asset, well, then you're basically screwed, because you want them to have mobility, to be able to grow, because they are, generally speaking, the majority. And the more you reduce poverty, the more people can spend, and thus the more developed your economy gets, and the higher it can scale relative to others. The United States is a great example of this because, while yes, we have a notable poor population, our poor population still has a lot of economic mobility that can be used and thus can be spent, which helps greatly for our economy, our taxes, and just general administration of the state. Now, of course, if you know the basics of economics, the next part shouldn't be too controversial, but economic growth is encouraged by lower taxation levels. Because more money is in the hands of civilians, they can spend more on it, and it's clear where their demands lie, because, well, they have more money. It just makes sense. More money to spend, higher economic growth, and thus, it's good to basically put your taxes at the limit of what you can reasonably afford. Now, some deficit spending is sometimes a necessity. I would advise against it generally. But for example, if there's a recession, it's often better to just cut taxes, accept a small deficit, and just let the economy bounce back than it would be to say let it stay at the same level and take a longer time to recover, because the economy really can't handle being stalled that well. It'll fix eventually, sure, but it's better to just get it out the way. Get it done, end the recession, get unemployment down, get things back on track. And that's actually where Reagan, for example, actually contributed to this country more than a lot of people give him credit for, because by cutting a lot of those taxes, oh yeah, sure, it definitely hurt our deficits in the short term, but in the long term, we actually have higher tax receipts post-Reagan, like literally directly post-him, than pre-Reagan levels. Why? Because even though taxes were functionally cut in half in relative terms compared to the start of his term and the end, the economic growth encouraged by those tax cuts allowed the economy to rise. And thus, you allow, for example, someone like Clinton to essentially just hold on to the budget as it is and let it go into surplus. Now, of course, with that being said, as mentioned up here, taxation removes funds from the economy. That's why this happens. If you take money out, generally speaking, there's less to spend, and thus less economic growth. But more specifically, while the state can make it up, it's far less efficient at actually growing the economy because, go figure, when you're managing a bureaucracy, it's a lot harder to actually get those investments where they're needed. Infrastructure helps greatly, but honestly, there's only so much infrastructure can do. If you build roads in every part of this country, literally every part, high-speed rail everywhere, that doesn't mean anything if no one's producing anything. You could have the best infrastructure in the world. It does not matter if no one wants to produce or no one wants to buy. And so what matters more than infrastructure is having the spending money to invest in what you want. That is how an economy grows. So by taxing, you remove funds from the economy. Now this can actually be good for one thing, taming inflation. If the inflation rate goes insane, let's say it's up 10%, if you start taxing 5% of people's incomes, well, guess what? That money is removed from the economy. You could quite literally burn those dollars for all it matters, so long as it doesn't re-enter the economy, and you have removed the money supply. Less money supply, lower inflation, and thus the prices grow slower or just start actually declining if you remove enough money. That is actually a very efficient, if not, shall we say, enjoyable way to lower inflation, legitimately. Just tax people to the point where they don't have the money to spend, and prices will naturally go down in equivalence because, well, if you need money, you're gonna need to have lower prices because no one has any other money. But of course, it does come with obvious problems, including higher poverty rates. Again, remove funds from the economy, economic growth slows down, mobility lowers, and people have less money to spend, so if they need something, let's say I need toilet paper, for example, well, I have less money to buy it, so if I'm poor, I'm stuck choosing between toilet paper, food, water, and other necessities, which isn't good. It also discourages economic growth, as mentioned previously. So when you're dealing with taxation, essentially what you want to do is not do progressive taxes all over the place or only tax one group. What you want to do instead is find a way to gain as much money as possible for as low rates as possible. And if you can trade taxing the poor for the rich, which sometimes you can, then it's better to tax the rich at an affordable level, with the poor picking up the slack, so that you can essentially balance the interests of both because, well, if the rich don't like your tax rates, they can just leave. And they can afford to live pretty much anywhere as long as the tax rate is low. If they make $1 million, let's say, I'm just using hypothetical, then paying $100,000 in taxes or $50,000 in living costs in another country, plus say $30,000 in taxes, is a worse deal in the former than the latter. The latter is the much better option. And so they can do it easily. They are the most mobile class. So you want to have some level of appeasement to them, while at the same time making it so that the poor can continue to be economically mobile, can grow. Now, generally this means screwing the middle class over, but that is to be expected, unfortunately. And so the best option is essentially to balance the budget, or in the case of high debt, pay the debt off quickly and lower taxes from there. There's a third option, getting rid of taxation, but that requires another source of income that isn't a forced levy. Tariffs are still a forced levy, so it'd be functionally the same. And so what you're left with is, well, permanent funds or other such ideas. Now, plenty of countries actually have a similar idea to this, for example, Norway and Saudi Arabia. But generally, these funds, usually based off of resource wealth, aren't actually meant to substitute for taxation, but instead they're investment funds, and my lord, that's freaking loud. Regardless, they're investment funds not meant to replace taxation, but they can be used to lower it. If we instead invested in a fund specifically to end taxation and replace it, theoretically we could. It's just, as of now, these are things to consider. Remember, there is a limit to how much you can tax effectively, built on both bureaucracy and also just willingness to pay. At a certain point, people just don't care. You could have guns to their faces and they just say no. Because people like their stuff. I believe it was Machiavelli who basically said people would rather have their father's inheritance than their own wife. Like they have a preference for it. And plenty of people do, as much as we may hate to admit it. There are people who would be more likely to fight over their inheritance than their family. And so you must always remember that. When it comes to taxes, you must always think, what can we do to balance the budget, one, and how can we make people accept this? Because realistically, people don't like paying more money. They just don't. So you have to weigh everything to try to minimize the amount of taxes they have to pay while maximizing the results of said taxes. Taxation is not an easy matter of just tax the rich, tax the businesses, tax yada yada yada. It's a balancing act, and you gotta weigh the pros and cons. So, I hope you enjoyed. Have a good day.